After 15 books on revolutionary America, John Ferling still has more to say about the early period in the life of the United States. Ferling is Professor Emeritus of History at the University of West Georgia. In the preface of his current book, Shots Heard Round the World, Professor Ferling opens with this quote, now that America will be commemorating the 250th anniversary of its War of Independence, he asks readers this question: what pops into your mind as you hear or witness references to that conflict? Professor Ferling gives his answer in a 500-page book focusing on America, Britain, and Europe in the Revolutionary War era. John Ferling, you ask at the very beginning of this book, what comes to mind with people when they think of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution? I want to ask you the same question. What's the first thing that comes to your mind?
Well, to my mind, I think it's the Declaration of Independence, and especially the opening part that Jefferson wrote, the natural rights of humankind and our natural rights to life and liberty, and the notion of equality for all people. That pops into my mind first. Although I've written so much about the war, the Revolutionary War is always on my mind, but first it's that the legacy of the Declaration of Independence.
In the introduction, I told our listeners that you've done 15 books. This is your 16th, and most of them are all about this time period in our history. Where have you gone personally to study the Revolutionary War?
Well, all over to tell you the truth. I mean, I of course started studying it in graduate school, and then once I became a college professor and taught and continued writing, I've done research at the Library of Congress, Historical Society of Pennsylvania, Massachusetts Historical Society, at Harvard. And fortunately, I was able to do a considerable amount of work in the library at the University of West Georgia out in suburban Atlanta, where I spent most of my career teaching. I came out around the time of the bicentennial in 1976, and lots and lots of things were being published in conjunction with the bicentennial, and money was flowing more. It was flowing better in academia in those days than it is today. And so, actually, my predecessor started building up the library with the funds that were available. I continued it, and we've continued all along. So we have the printed papers of the George Washington, John Adams, Franklin, and most of the founders, and lots of things that were published in conjunction with the bicentennial and subsequently. So I've been able to do a considerable amount of work right here.
Your first book in 1977 was before C-SPAN. We were 2 years after that. So I have to ask you about what led you to the Loyalist mind, Joseph Galloway, and the American Revolution.
Well, my mentor in graduate school really was Elizabeth Cometti, and Dr. Cometti was interested in the Loyalist, and she talked a lot about Joseph Galloway. Most of her writing was actually on women during the Revolution. She was one of the very first scholars to write about women during the Revolutionary era. But she was interested in the Loyalist, and I became interested in the Loyalists through her. And Galloway looked like a topic that no one had written on extensively, and so that's what I wound up doing. That's where I spent most of I mentioned earlier that I had worked at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania in downtown Philadelphia, and I went there and did some of the research on Galloway there. He published a number of pamphlets. I don't recall how many he published, probably more than a dozen during the Revolution. So there was a lot that was available in microform fashion in those days. But there were also some papers of Galloway at the Library of Congress. And it's kind of interesting because he had had to flee Philadelphia, where he was from, and when the British Army abandoned Philadelphia in 1778, he went to New York, but his wife stayed in Philadelphia, and they corresponded. And the way Galloway was able to correspond with her, he would write letters that were on real long pieces of paper, but only about that thick. So it was tiny writing, and he would roll up the letters and put them inside quills of pens and then mail them to his wife in Philadelphia. And the rebel authorities never caught on that there was correspondence in there, but they survived, and the correspondence survived. So that was what I was using at the Library of Congress.
Tell me these names I mean, and I want you to define them. What was a loyalist?
Well, a loyalist was somebody who remained loyal to Britain and refused to support the revolution. And there were quite a few of them in the colonists. John Adams said that the population was divided one third, one third, one third. One third supported the revolution, one third remained loyal, and one third didn't care one way or another. But today, I think over the last 50 years or so, with work done on loyalists, most scholars say that about 20% of the people who were activists in the revolution remained loyal to Britain and actually did support the British during the war. And there was really, I mean, they supported it in a number of ways. Sometimes they fled to cities that were occupied by Britain, which included New York and Charleston and Savannah and briefly Philadelphia during the Revolutionary War. But then a great many of them, about 15,000 men, joined what were called provincial regiments that the British raised during the war. And there were people in the North, lots of Southerners joined the provincial regiments. They were usually commanded by a regular British officer, but everybody else was an American who was in those units. And actually, by 1780, which would, I guess, be about 6 years, maybe 7 years into the Revolutionary War, there were actually more Americans serving with the British Army than were serving in Washington's Continental Army. So so the Loyalists played quite a role. Many of them, like Galloway and others, wrote pamphlets trying to persuade the Americans, sort of a fifth column movement during the war to try to convince Americans that who were supporting the revolution that they were on the wrong track, that the Americans couldn't win the war and whatever. So the Loyalists, and some of them acted as spies and intelligence officials. And in fact, Galloway himself wound up as a British intelligence official, and he was very active in the Battle of Brandywine in September of 1777. He showed the British Army a way to get across the Brandywine Creek that Washington was unfamiliar with, and they made an attack on the American flank and darn near won the Battle of Brandywine. The Loyalists played a number of roles during the Revolutionary War.
Who were the rebels?
Well, the rebels were that's what the British called them, and the rebels were those who supported the American Revolution. We might call them patriots. The British didn't think of them as patriots. These were the guys the men and women who supported the American Revolution, and they were the lion's share of people in the colonies. And then after 1776, with independence, so the colonies became states. So they were the people in the states that supported the revolution. And there, as the war goes along, the goes on and on and on. It's America's longest war until the Vietnam War. So it was a very long, difficult war. The economy breaks down, and as it breaks down and the war drags on, morale begins to wane somewhat, I think probably some of the people who supported the revolution at the beginning maybe didn't lose faith, didn't break with their support for the revolution, but they certainly began to wonder if it was going to succeed.
You tell us in the book that a person that joined up with the rebels or the patriots only served a year. And I think you have a statistic, something like only 7% re-upped after that first year.
Well, in 1776, I think 7% re-upped. The first 2 years, men enlisted for just 1 year. And Washington immediately thought there was going to be problems and tried to get Congress to extend in fact, to make a standing army, have men come in for the duration of the army. And his fears were borne out because the war gets started. The army is raised beginning in the summer of 1775, and at the end of 1775, almost all of the men who had enlisted went home. I mean, many of them, I think, came in thinking that this was going to be a glorious, maybe a fun-loving experience. The last war had come to an end about 15 years earlier. So if you were 18 or 19 years old, you probably didn't remember very much about the 7 Years' War. You had heard older men talk about the war, probably embellishing their tales about the war, and so it seemed like a grand, glorious venture. And men came in, and then they learned how difficult it was to serve in the military. But even in 1776, they had a good recruiting year. Men continued to come in, and there have been some studies, especially of small New England villages in 1775 and 1776, where records exist, and an enormous percentage of young men and some older men went into the service. I mean, they were acting. I said they were acting because they thought it was going to be a grand, glorious thing. But many of them were genuine patriots who sought independence and aspired for American independence. And so, at the end of their 1 year enlistment, only about 7% re-enlisted. And so at that point, with things going awry with the British invasion of New York in the late summer and early fall of 1776, Congress finally listened to Washington and began to try to build a standing army and eliminate the 1 year enlistment. So Washington asked them to conscript men into the service beginning in 1776, but Congress never took that step. what Congress did was offer bounties to get men to come in for longer periods, and what they particularly wanted was men to come in for a 3-year hitch in the Continental Army. And the enticement that they offered was land, about 100 acres of land following the war. It was a real gamble to join for land, because first you had to get independence before you could get the land, and then the land, much of the land that was available was on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains, where indigenous people lived who didn't particularly want these people coming in and taking their land. But some men did enlist under those terms. But what Congress did was assign quotas to each state. And the states internally, such as Massachusetts, for example, then assigned quotas to each village or each county. And if say a town couldn't meet its quota, then that town would resort to conscription. And usually, not more than 3 or 4 men from a town wound up actually being conscripted. If you knew you were going to get conscripted, you might as well join and get some sort of bounty for it. So, not many men were actually conscripted into the service, but some certainly were. But the conscription was done more at the state and local level. And the guys who got conscripted were almost invariably the youngest guy who happened to be in the local militia, a young single man. I mean, that I wouldn't say it was exclusively those people who got conscripted, but they were the lion's share of the ones who got dragooned and into military service.
You have this paragraph in the book that I wanted to ask you about on page 210. Washington did not want black men in the army. His response sprang from racism, fear black soldiers would pass along their weapons to slaves.
Right.
How
Yeah.
does
No,
how does that sit with you as you look back at history?
well, now when I wrote that, I was thinking about, I mean, it was describing Washington's feelings in 1775. He takes command in June of 75, and he finds that there are some blacks in the military. These were New England soldiers. Most of them were from Massachusetts, but there were some others from various colonies in New England. They were in the army, and Washington initially asked if he could remove them from the army, and Congress wouldn't permit him to take that step. But then Congress did say at the end of 1775 that no more blacks were to be recruited into the army. Well, that was 1775, but by the time the war drags into 1776 and 1777 and 1778, it's more and more difficult to get men to come in to enlist in the army. And the notion begins to grow, really starts with Rhode Island. Let's begin to bring blacks into the military. And at that point, Washington agreed to do that. I mean, he needed manpower badly, and he was willing to accept blacks at that point. However, a little bit later on in the war, when the war really shifts to the South, John Lawrence, who was a colonel in the Army and on Washington's staff, and Alexander Hamilton, who was very close to Lawrence and was also a colonel and on Washington's staff, they both pushed Washington to permit South Carolina to include blacks in their military. And Washington couldn't compel that, and Congress couldn't compel South Carolina to do that. But if Washington had spoken out and written authorities in South Carolina, it's conceivable that South Carolina might have agreed to do that. But Washington refused to do that. And the question that's difficult to answer is, did Washington refuse to support bringing blacks in because he was a racist, or was it in essence a tactical move because he was afraid that taking that step might lead South Carolina to buckle and drop out of the war? And I think by that point, my own feeling is that Washington was acting because he was afraid that it would be counterproductive in South Carolina. That there was the governor of South Carolina had come close to cutting a deal with British General Prevost in early in 1780. That if Prevost wouldn't conduct a siege of Charleston, South Carolina would become a neutral colony in the war and refused to support independence any longer. So Washington, I think, looked on South Carolina as kind of shaky terrain to begin with, and I think that was why he refused Lawrence and Hamilton's request that he besieged South Carolina to bring blacks into to allow blacks into their army. South Carolina never did during the war. Other Southern states did. There were some blacks who served in Virginia, for example, and quite a few in the North. And in the end, the records are kind of spotty, but most historians feel that probably about 100,000 men served in the Continental Army, and about 5,000, about 5% of those who served were blacks who came in with the promise that in return for serving, they would gain their freedom at the end of the war when independence was won. And this really happens in the last 2 years of the war. And those last 2 years are a desperate period of the war. So the fact that 5% were in there uh, was um, was crucial for keeping the army together and having manpower in the army. One of the interesting things was when the French army joined with Washington's army in the summer of 1781, right in the campaign that would lead to Yorktown. They saw the American army really for the first time, and they were shocked at what they saw about the condition of the men. But Washington had them parade and for the French and whatever. And several of the French soldiers said that it was the black soldiers who actually seemed to be the best at marching and whatever. And they were impressed with the black soldiers that they saw in Washington's army.
We'll be right back.
Let me ask you some brief questions just to put it in context. Uh, I don't want to get into the 7 Years' War because that can go on forever. But what was the last year of the 7 Years' War, and what impact did that have on the beginning of the Revolutionary War in the United States?
Okay, well, the 7 Years' War, for all practical purposes, ends about 1760 in the colonies. But the treaty that ended the war was in 1763. And so it's about, if you take it from the time of the Treaty of Paris that ended the 7 Years' War, it's about a dozen years until the Revolutionary War breaks out. And I think the impact of that is I can maybe mention a couple of things. One is that some of the men who served in the war as officers, like Washington or Philip Schuyler from New York and others, gained military experience that would come in handy during the Revolutionary War. But the other thing, as far as the Americans are concerned, is that the French were driven out. They relinquished their control of Canada in the Treaty of Paris that ended the war. And Canada, which had been a French province since the early 17th century, now was held by Great Britain. And as long, many of the people, John Adams even mentions this in one of his early letters when he's 19 or 20 years old or so, that until that point, the British, the American colonists relied on the British to protect them from the French in Canada, because there were four intercolonial wars between the Britain and France, with the American colonies being dragged into each of those wars. The 7 Years' War was the fourth and last of those wars before the Revolution. And so the British did protect the Americans from the French, but now the French are removed from Canada, and so there were people like Adams who in essence were saying, well, why do we need Britain any longer? Because the French aren't there; they're no longer a threat on our northern border. But then, taking a broader perspective, the French and the Spanish had lost heavily in the 7 Years' War against the British. The French in particular they had not only lost Canada, they had lost some islands in the Caribbean, they had lost some trading outposts in what we think of as India and the subcontinent now, and on the west coast of Africa. And though it may not seem like it was much, they lost their access to the fisheries, the Newfoundland fisheries. But that was a big deal in the 18th century. It generated enormous fortunes in France, and it was also a training ground for sailors. And when France would go to war, they would conscript those sailors from the merchant fleets into the French Navy. So the French lost considerably, and so did Spain. Spain lost Florida, among other things, as a result of the 7 Years' War. And Florida at that time, I might mention, included not only the present state of Florida, but the southern portions of what we think of as Alabama and Mississippi. So they called it East Florida and West Florida at the time. But so both of them had lost heavily, and the French had really suffered enormous defeats in their navy. And so I think one thing of absolute consequence of the 7 Years' War is that the French wanted revenge against the British, and not only revenge, but they wanted to restore France to the grandeur that it had enjoyed back in the days of Louis XIV and Louis XV. And so the French, almost immediately, even before the Treaty of Paris ended the war, the French began rebuilding their navy. And building a navy in the 18th century, probably in the 21st century for that matter, but in the 18th century took a long, long time to build a ship of war, a man of war. And so from the very beginning, the French calculated that their navy would not be really the equal of the British fleet until about 1778. It would take around 15 years for them to construct a navy, and that was only if the British didn't get into an arms race with them, and they didn't. The British didn't really build very many ships between the the 7 Years' War and the Revolution. So I think the 7 Years' War is a war of considerable importance in the coming of the American Revolution and of France and Spain's involvement in the war.
Did I understand you to say that the total number of patriots in this country back in 1776 and that during that Revolutionary War that there were 100,000?
Well, 100,000 joined the Continental Army, but then there were militia forces beyond that. And the records for the Continental Army aren't totally intact, but there's pretty good collection of records there. The militia records are something else. And so you have to guess considerably about how many men actually did serve in the militia. And the estimates range as high as maybe 200,000 men. I mean, as a general rule, men served in the militia from ages 16 to about 60. And the militia existed in all 13 colonies. The British brought it over. The very first British settlers here who came over on the Mayflower and down to Virginia and elsewhere brought the militia with them. So it was a British tradition. The British had used militia themselves to defend the home islands, and they brought it over to America. So there may have been as many as 300,000 men who were under arms at one time or another. No one would suggest there were 300,000 at any one time during the Revolutionary War, but maybe that many served. Although it's kind of tricky because with the militia, sometimes a man might be called to active duty, and then a couple of years might pass before he's summoned to active duty again. So it's kind of difficult to know exactly the number that served, but certainly thousands and maybe as many as 300,000 did during the war.
How many died?
Uh, that's a good question. I think because of the total absence of records, but I think most historians say that probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 35,000 who served in the Continental Army died. So that's 35,000 out of 100,000, 35%. And in World War II, only 1% of the GIs, American GIs, perished in that war. But it's difficult to put an exact figure on it because some of the records no longer exist, but also many men were taken captive during the war and wound up in British prisons and died while in captivity, and some of those records don't exist. And again, the records from the militia aren't complete. So at least 35,000, I think, probably died during the war. And these are people who were active soldiers and died not so much in combat. There were it was fairly small percentage of the death toll came on the battlefield. If you were wounded in battle, the chances of survival were much smaller than would have been the case in World War II or in our subsequent conflicts because of the state of medical training and whatever. Most of the men died of diseases. Many men were malnourished. They were ill-clad. If when they were housed, they were living in drafty barracks without proper heating. They didn't have proper nutrition. They were living in close quarters, and it was easy for diseases, viruses, and whatever, and especially smallpox to spread. But Washington did begin to have his men inoculated for smallpox early, and about a year into the war, he began to do that, and that cut down the death toll from smallpox. But the death toll was from diseases was really considerable all through the war. I mean, in the 20th century, men did die of accidents and whatever, and other causes other than battlefield wounds, but nothing along the lines of the disease toll from the Revolutionary War. And the same thing, by the way, was happening with the in the other with the in the enemy forces and with our allied forces when France and Spain came into the war, they tried to invade England in 1779, and disease broke out in their navies, and literally thousands of Spanish and French sailors died. They never managed to step foot on British soil in that invasion attempt. So diseases were, I mean, they just took a great toll, and always, I mean, even when in peacetime disease took a toll, and of younger people as well. Not very many. I mean, a large number, much probably as many as 20% of people died before they ever reached adulthood, and lots of younger men perished in peacetime too. George Washington's father was in his mid 40s. Thomas Jefferson's father was in his mid 40s or so when both of them died of some sort of fever that was rampaging through where they lived.
There's one line in this book. I am not a historian, so um, I'm I'm setting it up so that I don't sound like a complete fool. I I've never heard this before. It's probably the most important line in your whole book, and I'm going to use the French pronunciation when I read it to you, and I need it explained. You say Vergennes or Vergennes in English sought an independent United States, but a weak nation that would remain dependent on France for maintaining its independence. The line, though, that really got my attention: American independence, in all likelihood, would never have been gained had it not been for Vergennes. Who is Vergennes, and why did you
Okay.
come down so hard on that subject?
Okay. Well, uh, I wrote an article that came out in April of this year for the online journal of the American Revolution, and I titled the article "America's Forgotten Founder." So I was kind of tongue in cheek, but certainly Vergennes was the French foreign minister during the war. He became France's foreign minister about 7 or 8 months before the Revolutionary War broke out. He had a long career as a diplomat. He had served in Constantinople and in Stockholm, and was in fact France's ambassador, and he was in Stockholm when he was asked to be the French foreign minister. And Louis XVI, the French monarch, wrote a letter to Vergennes, and he said, "Everything I've heard about you is good, and you're a trustworthy individual, and I'd like for you to become the foreign minister." So Vergennes did become the French foreign minister, as I mentioned, a few months before the Revolutionary War broke out, and he really at this point pursues the same sort of policy that his predecessor, the Duc de Choiseul, had pursued, and that was building the French Navy, anticipating a war with Britain, preparing for a war with Britain. And Vergennes remains the French foreign minister throughout the war and for 3 or 4 years beyond the war. John Adams didn't get along with him at all, and Vergennes didn't like John Adams. But following the war, Jefferson became the American minister to France, and Jefferson had a much more positive view of Vergennes. He found him well organized, well informed, hardworking, and whatever. So he's the French foreign minister throughout the Revolutionary War, and he in that first sentence that you read, he did support American independence, but he wanted America to remain a client state of France, that it could be helpful in numerous ways, he thought, to France, but he didn't want the United States to become a rich, powerful country that might step on French toes down the road. But he did favor independence, and he's from the very beginning hopeful that he can assist America in breaking away from Britain. Because the bottom line with Vergennes' thinking was the uh, that Britain had become a major power, really the strongest single power at that point in the 18th century. And Vergennes was convinced that the reason for Britain's rise to power in the course of the 18th century was because of its possession of this empire in America. The empire generated enormous wealth for the British, and the wealth translated into power. And so Vergennes felt that if if the British could somehow or other lose its empire in America, then British power would be considerably weakened, and France in turn would grow stronger and would once again become a preeminent power as it had been under Louis XIV and Louis XV.
Specifically, though, Vergennes did what that impacted the American side in the Revolutionary War?
Sure. Yeah, from the very beginning, even when Courcelles was the foreign minister, but prior to Vergennes, as soon as he learned that there were problems in the empire, the protests against the Stamp Act and the Townshend duties and the other American protests 10 years or so before the war broke out, Courcelles sent secret agents to America to determine whether maybe the French could do something to whip up a revolution in America. He found out that wasn't going to work, so they just bided their time. And once the war did break out, and Vergennes is foreign minister at that point, then he sees this as the opportunity that France may have been waiting for. And so he sends an agent over to America, an agent named Bonvillars, who was a French army officer, and he arrives in Philadelphia in December, just before Christmas of 1775. So the war had begun in April. This is in December of that first year of the war. And Bonvillars arrives in Philadelphia. He had been there before. He had some contacts in Philadelphia, and he was able to set up a meeting very quickly with a committee of Congress that was called the Secret Committee. And Benjamin Franklin was one of the members of Congress who was part of that committee. And so they met in secret, so secretly, in fact, that most members of Congress weren't aware that the meetings were taking place. The Congress was meeting at the Pennsylvania State House that we call Independence Hall today, but their meetings took place in Carpenter's Hall, which is still standing in Philadelphia. And at the meetings, uh, Bonvillars learned that, or he came away feeling that the Americans were going to fight to the last man to gain, to break away from England, that the army was well led, that but didn't have the resources to wage a long war. And it needed the army needed arms, it needed ammunition, it needed everything, uniforms, tents, bayonets, whatever. And so Bonvillars goes back to France and he sends a report to Vergennes in which he tells Vergennes they need help, and if we can provide help, then uh, the war can continue. Otherwise, it's probably not going to. It's going to be a very short war and short time before the British suppress the rebellion. And so Vergennes goes to the King's Council, Louis XVI's council, and makes a pitch for providing secret assistance to the Americans. The key is the word secret there. And he does run into some opposition. He's the French finance minister Turgot was opposed to secret assistance. He was afraid that um, uh, if Britain learned what was going on, Britain would come into the war. He knew how the shaky condition, really deplorable condition of the French economy. And he said, if Britain comes into the war, the first shot of that war will lead to French bankruptcy. And so the aid had to be secret. And ultimately, the King's Council did approve providing secret aid to the Americans, and Louis XVI supported it. And in fact, Louis XVI, time after time after time, stays with Vergennes. First, it's secret assistance that he approves in 1776. Then in 1778, he approves an alliance with America and sending a fleet over to America. Then in 1780, he approves staying in the war, which was questionable at that point, and sending an army and a larger fleet to America. So Louis XVI follows what Vergennes is recommending at virtually every step of this war. And the tragedy is that for Louis XVI, the tragedy is that when the French Revolution comes along, he's going to go to the guillotine in 1793. And just as a sidelight, wanted to mention one of my heroes of the Revolution is Thomas Paine. And Thomas Paine, who had written Common Sense and the American Crisis during the war, wound up in France and was a member of the French Assembly in the 1790s. And when the French Assembly debated Louis XVI's fate, Paine said, look, he supported America. I served him in America. Let's spare Louis XVI, and instead of executing him, exile him to America. And he conceived what republicanism is like in America, and it will further and strengthen republicanism in France and throughout Europe. But the Assembly voted to send Louis XVI to the guillotine, and that was his fate.
We'll be right back.
A couple of months ago, talked to Rick Atkinson about his book on the Revolution, and we talked about the statues that are down across from the White House, including Rochambeau, Frenchman, and Lafayette. I want to ask you this: where is the statue of Vergennes in the United States?
Well, I don't think you can find one. I looked around to see if there's any town or county named for him, and the only one that I've been able to find is a town in Vermont that's named for him. Now maybe there's another that I overlooked. I mean, I can understand why there's not a Galloway, Pennsylvania, for example, because he bet on the wrong side. But Vergennes just hasn't been recognized. There's not a move in the works to build a statue for John Adams in Washington right now. But as of right now, there's not a statue of John Adams in Washington.
For that matter, why isn't there a statue of Thomas Paine somewhere?
Yeah, that's well, when I first started teaching, I was 22 years old, I guess, and I taught for 2 years in a high school in Texas, and before I started graduate school. And in those, I don't know what Texas does now. I haven't lived there for most of my adult life. I live in Georgia now. But in those days, to get a high school American history textbook adopted, it had to be recommended by a state commission, and they chose 5 books. If it wasn't one of those 5 books, you couldn't use that textbook. And in those days, they would not include a book on their list of 5 that included Thomas Paine. So, and supposedly it was because Paine wasn't a Christian and he wrote an attack on organized religion and he was a deist and whatever. Could have been because of his radical political ideas as well. But yeah, I don't think anything's named. I'm not sure about this, but I don't think anything's named for Paine. There's certainly not a statue of Paine anywhere around in the United States.
There's a little house up in New Rochelle, New York, that
Yeah,
where
right.
they honor him. Let me ask you about your own upbringing. Where were you born?
I was born in Charleston, West Virginia. My dad had the misfortune of coming out of high school just as the Great Depression hit. And so he was unemployed for a while or just had pickup jobs for a while. And then in 1934, he got on with Union Carbide, which was a huge petrochemical industry. And their main plant was in Charleston, West Virginia. And so my mom and dad lived there for, I think, a half a dozen years or so. And that's where I was born. And one year after I was born, my dad got transferred to Texas City, Texas. Carbide was building a new plant there. So were lots of other petrochemical industries. And what was going on is this was right between the beginning of World War II in Europe and Pearl Harbor. And I think the Roosevelt administration and Congress understood that the day was coming when the U.S. was going to get into the war. And so they were issuing defense contracts to major industries. And Carbide got a contract and built a plant in Texas City, and my dad got sent there. So I was raised in Texas City, which is down on the Gulf Coast on Galveston Bay, about 40 miles or so south of Houston.
Where'd you go to undergrad for your first degree?
I went to a state college in Texas, Sam Houston State University, that's about 50 miles north of Houston.
Then your PhD was from where?
Well, I went to Baylor University for my master's degree and to West Virginia University for my PhD. Let me mention about my undergraduate work because I had really a transformative experience in that process. One of those things where life can take an unexpected turn. I had to take, and I think this was pretty much true all across the country at this point in the 1950s, that at almost every school, every student had to take four courses in history, two Western civilization courses, two U.S. history survey courses. And I took the first three and actually absolutely hated the courses. I'm never going to finish my requirement, never take another history course in my life. They were just lecture courses. You memorized the notes you took, fed it back on the exams, and then forgot everything that you had memorized. And so I got into the last course, which was on a Western civilization course. And 1 week into the course, the professor who was teaching it was another lecture course, fell ill, and he had to go in the hospital. And so, in time-honored tradition of the workplace, they ran the lowest man on the totem pole in to teach the course, and he was a freshly minted PhD out of the University of Missouri named William Painter. And Dr. Painter came in that first day and he said, I go to the bookstore and buy these 5 paperback books. And every class period, I'm gonna assign about 50 to 75 pages for you to read, and we'll discuss what you've read. And it just became a transformative experience for me. It was like nothing I had ever experienced previously. And by the end of the semester, I decided I wanted to teach in college, and that I also wanted to write. And I remember one day going to Dr. Painter's office and asking him, how do you teach in college? And he explained graduate school to me, which I had no idea about at the time. So it was one of those things that just happened, and had the professor not fallen ill, and I probably would have wound up majoring in political science and never taken another history course in my life.
Here's the question, though. Do you remember any of those 5 books?
I remember two of them. One of them was Alan Bullock's biography of Hitler, called Hitler: A Study in Tyranny. And when I wrote my biography of George Washington in 1988, I sort of used a technique that Bullock used in his book. In the middle of Bullock's book, he has a chapter that was called, I believe he entitled it The Emperor Without Clothes. And what he did was he looked at the private side of Hitler. And so when I wrote my biography of Washington, I didn't entitle it The Emperor with No Clothes, but I entitled it The Private Washington, and talked about Mount Vernon and Washington as a farmer and this and that about the private side of Washington. So Bullock's book was one of the 5, and the other one that I remember actually was on George Washington, and it was Marcus Conloff's little book that was called Washington, Man and Monument. And it wasn't a biography, it was just kind of an analytical assessment of Washington. I wish I could remember the other 3 books, but I can't. And I told that story about Dr. Painter's class influencing me to Peter Gannett, who was my long-term editor, first at Oxford University Press and then at Bloomsbury. And he said, "That's a good story. Put it in the preface to, I think it was Setting the World Ablaze that came out in 2000." So I wrote that story, and someone else who, and I never knew who it was, who had taken Dr. Painter and became a historian and was teaching at a college in North Carolina, read the book, saw that story, and wrote to Dr. Painter. So Dr. Painter then wrote to me. He was teaching at University of North Texas at that point, and he wrote to me, and we corresponded until till Dr. Painter's death a few years later. So,
Well, as we open, we're about out of time, but as we opened up, we talked about your 1977 book. I don't know that this will work for you, but I'm going to try a lightning round, as they say, but just get you to react very quickly about these people you've written about and what, just to get a sense of what you think. What's your opinion of Jefferson?
Jefferson, I admire Jefferson as a thinker, somebody who really wanted to eliminate slavery, if possible, supporter of education, and as I mentioned earlier, the author of the natural rights and egalitarian notions in the Declaration of Independence. His legacy's blighted by the fact that he was a slave owner and refused to free his slaves.
Alexander Hamilton.
Hamilton, I disagree with in the sense that in the last letter that he wrote, he said democracy is the poison of America. But he was a brilliant guy, and he was on the right track with the economic policies that he supported as Washington's Secretary of State or Secretary of Treasury. Um, got on the wrong foot with John Adams. Adams was right and Hamilton was wrong when because of Hamilton's pushing toward hostilities with France during Adams's presidency.
What about Adams?
Yeah, Adams is really, I think, among the people that are thought of as the founders. I'm not thinking of Tom Paine here for a moment. Adams is really my favorite. I've always sort of suspected that if Adams had lived at a different time, he might have chosen, and colleges were like they are today, that Adams might have chosen to become a college professor of history and not a lawyer. I have no way of knowing that for sure, but I liked Adams. There were problems with him, but by and large, I really liked John Adams.
By the way, I don't know if you've ever seen it, your Wikipedia page has connections on it, and it's not something that we did, to 8 of the programs that we've done with you over the years. And all you have to do is click on them, and they can watch. They can watch
Oh,
our interview in 2004. We had another one in 2018.
right.
You did an in-depth with us a few years ago, but there's a lot of John Ferling on your Wikipedia site.
Oh, well, I haven't looked at it in years, so I didn't realize that was on there. And the
Which
last time I looked at it, it had me born in Charleston, South Carolina, rather than Charleston, West Virginia, where I was. I don't know if anybody ever corrected
I
that. I
think they did.
remember,
Yeah.
I remember on your, I don't know if it was Booknotes or Q&A, but you had somebody on who was from Wikipedia, and they told how to actually edit something on Wikipedia. And I did go in and edit something about myself one time. This was 20 some years ago. But I haven't looked at it in years now.
All right, last question. You've done 16 books, all of them about the same era, Revolutionary War era. Which one sold the most?
I think it's almost a miracle, which is a general history of the Revolutionary War that Oxford University Press published in 2007. It didn't make the bestseller list, but it was the best selling of my books, and I think probably the the other two that have sold really well is Adams versus Jefferson, which is on the election of 1800. So every 4 years, when a presidential election comes around, it gets some play. And I wrote a book, Jefferson and Hamilton, that Bloomsbury published in 2013, I think it was, and it has been a good seller as well.
Are you going to continue writing?
Actually, I am. I have a book coming out in April, but it's not on the revolution. I'm doing something on, and it's something I've always wanted to do. I'm a lifelong baseball fan, and it's a book on baseball. It's entitled "Baseball as It Was," and it looks at what baseball was like in the 1940s and 1950s. And Patra, small commercial publisher in New York City, is publishing. The book is due out sometime in April.
John Ferling, former professor emeritus, at the University of West Georgia. The book is called, the current book, brand new, called Shots Heard Round the World, America, Britain, and Europe in the Revolutionary War. Thank you very much, sir.
Well, thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it, Brian.
Thanks for tuning into this week's Booknotes Plus podcast. If you have a moment, please consider rating and reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts. Your feedback will help others discover the program. And don't forget to share this episode with friends and family. For the latest on new episodes, schedule updates, and more, follow us on X @C-SPAN Radio.